Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and today's special guest is my favorite author. He's the most prolific and popular celebrity biographer in the history of publishing. He's written a staggering 25 books, 16 of which were New York Times bestsellers. His impeccably researched books are about every major entertainer, including Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor, Diana Ross, Cher, Madonna, Sinatra, Michael Jackson, Beyonce, and so many more. He's also written about political figures, including the Hiltons, the Kennedys, and his latest book is entitled Grace and Steel, Dorothy, Barbara, Laura, and the Women of the Bush Dynasty. He also regularly appears on television as an entertainment news reporter on programs such as Entertainment Tonight, Good Morning America, Today, and CBS This Morning. What a thrill to welcome Randy Taraborrelli to our show. Randy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Harvey. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you.
Randy, can you just start by telling us, how did you develop an interest in writing celebrity biographies?
I was actually a reporter writing up interviews with R&B stars back in the 1970s and into the 1980s for a newspaper called Soul Magazine. And one day I got a phone call. I picked up the phone and it was Jacqueline Onassis, who was an editor at Doubleday. And she had seen a series of articles that I wrote about Diana Ross in the magazine and Soul newspaper. And she liked the stories, and she asked me if I might consider writing a book about Diana Ross. And believe it or not, I turned her down. I was so used to writing small features that the idea of writing a book, it just seemed so intimidating to me. And this is like 30 years ago. And then the idea that Jacqueline Onassis was going to be my first editor, that was a little too much to handle at that time. So anyway, fast forward about 6 months, the magazine went out of business, and then I no longer had a job. And I was talking to my mom and telling her I just didn't know what to do with my life. And she said those words that you never expect your mother to say to you, which is, you should call Jackie Kennedy, right? and so I did. I called Jacqueline, and she remembered who I was, and she still wanted to meet me and wanted to publish the book at Doubleday. And I went to New York, and that was the first time I met her. And we had a really great relationship from the very beginning. And that's how I ended up writing my first book, which was a pictorial, it was like a picture book of millions of great pictures of Diana Ross with, extended captions. And it was published by Doubleday back in, I think, around 1985.
I wonder if Jackie Kennedy Onassis had any idea that one day you would be writing about her.
I often wonder that as well, because, during the course of many conversations with her during that time, she told me something that I wrote about in my book, After Camelot, which was, she said that, what good is a biography if it doesn't reveal secrets? And I thought, wow, that's an interesting thing coming from one of the most enigmatic women in the world, coming from a woman who never gave interviews, coming from a woman that people wanted to know so much about and never really had the opportunity to know anything about her. And for her to say that to me really struck a chord. And I often think about that. And I often think about, the times I worked with Jackie. And I have to tell you that I've done, I think, maybe 4 Kennedy books now. And I'm writing a Jackie biography right now in this moment. And I think that it's helped me a lot to be able to have history with her, to be able to sort of feel a responsibility to her. It's a different thing when you have had a relationship with your subject.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah, and I was going to say I never had a relationship with Grace Kelly, for instance. And I wrote about her, and I love that book, and it's a really great book, I think, personally. But I think it would have helped a lot if I had actually known Grace Kelly, and I didn't. But I did know Jackie, and so that's helped me a lot in writing about her.
What really impresses me is that she saw something in those articles you wrote for Soul Magazine. She could see the potential and planted the seed in your head to do what would end up becoming your life's work. It's quite astonishing.
It really is. When I think about my life and I think about the people who've come into my life and who have been pivotal in my life, it is really remarkable and makes you really sort of realize that there are no accidents, that people come into your life for a reason. And to think that, Jackie Kennedy ever was a part of my life and that I went on to write books about her is kind of astonishing to me and a little bit overwhelming sometimes.
Now, most of your books are about women. You are clearly drawn to women's stories, Randy. Why?
That's a good question, Harvey. I think, it's easy to sort of paint this with a wide brush stroke, and perhaps it's not fair, but I do think that women are generally more sort of in touch with their emotions, and they have, as a result of that, bigger emotional lives than a lot of men. And I like the emotion that's attached to women's stories. I like the sort of the grounding of family, and I love smart, courageous women. And I definitely have gravitated toward, I have written about men, of course, Michael Jackson, Frank Sinatra, but it's the women that I've written about: Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, Jacqueline Kennedy, Diana Ross, Cher, Carol Burnett. Those women really mean a lot to me. And I'm also very protective of my subjects. I perhaps am a little bit too protective of them. I really want my readers to love my subjects by the time they finish the book. That doesn't mean that they're not going to disagree with them during the course of the journey. People make decisions that often are not popular and often are not, the right decisions. And that's how we live our lives. But I want my readers to really love my subjects by the time they finish the book.
Randy, how do you decide who you want to write about?
Well, I wish that I could say that anytime I make a decision about somebody I want to write about, I get the opportunity to do that. That is not the way it works. How it works is I pitch an idea to my publisher, and it goes around and around, and then sometimes they say yes and sometimes they say no. But I only write about people that I like. I mean, that is sort of my mandate. That's how I choose a subject. It's got to be somebody that I really admire. It's got to be somebody that I think has a great story that's admirable, that will lift my readers, that will make them think, that will inspire them, and somebody who also inspires me, because it takes many years out of my life to write a book. And I don't want to spend those years with somebody that doesn't inspire. So to answer your question, yeah, it has to be somebody that I enjoy and somebody that I love. But not every person that I enjoy and I love, I'm able to write about, because it also has to be somebody who's extremely marketable and that my publisher will believe will make for a New York Times bestseller.
Maybe this is an obvious question, but I would think that the fact that you're a big fan of the person you're writing about would color the way you write about them.
That's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. It does. I think that what readers generally don't understand about biography is that it really the book is really as much a reflection of the guy writing it as it is the subject. I see all of my subjects through the prism of my own experience and my own biases, my own opinions,
and your own sensibilities,
and my own. You're right. My own sensibilities. So the book really does reflect me as much as it does the subject. I think that when you read one of my books, you know exactly how I was raised.
Yeah.
You know exactly what I think about life. You know exactly what I think about people. You know what I love. You know what I don't like. And, so when people say, a book should just be the facts of a person's life, that never happens. Not a good book anyway. A good book is not only the facts of a person's life, but it's the author's interpretation of those facts. It's the author's sort of take on those facts. That's why you can read 5 or 6 different books about Elizabeth Taylor, and they will all be very different. One book might be very shaming of her. One book, might be very pessimistic about her experience, or you can read my book, and I hope you do, and you will love her when you finish the book, because I loved her as I was writing it.
I think that you inject your values, your love of family, your love of sincerity, your love of human interaction. Like I said, your sensibilities, it all really does come through. I feel like I knew you long before today because I read your books.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I appreciate that, and I tell you, I think that my mom and dad would appreciate that, because they raised me and my brother and sister with certain values and to be, a certain way. And the interesting thing about my family is that we don't have fights in my family. Like we don't have that thing that many people have. And I often hear about it from my friends, where you can't invite this one over for Christmas because this one doesn't get along with that one, and that one hates this one, and this sister-in-law won't get along. We don't have that. We have never had that in my family, ever. I mean, it's just never happened. And I think it's because of the way that the three of us, my brother, sister, and I, were raised, that we have always found a way, to get past, any disagreements. And I think that it's that willingness to compromise and see the other point of view that has made my work as a biographer maybe so compelling and so fair-minded
And very compassionate.
And compassionate. Thank you.
Now, your books are meticulously researched and incredibly comprehensive. I'm always amazed that you manage to get access to people who can give you the real facts about the celebrity you're writing about. You're almost like a private detective. How do you manage to do that?
Well, I don't do it on my own. I have researchers who have worked with me since 1989. My chief researcher, her name is Kathy Griffin. She's amazing. I could not have done any of my books without her. She is somebody who will find the people that we need to talk to, and she'll convince them that they will have their story told in an honest way. And then she will do preliminary interviews with them, and then I will follow up with interviews of my own. So it's been a long time since I've had to track a person down. I certainly did that earlier in my career, knocking on doors, begging people to talk to me. And even today, of course, once we find a person, very often that person needs to be convinced, and then I will do that. It's not as difficult as it used to be in my early career because people know who I am now. And, we have a reputation with the bestsellers, and most people, have read one of my books along the way. And so they kind of know that they're not going to regret talking to me. We generally don't have a hard time convincing people these days. But back in the beginning of my career, yeah, it was really difficult when people didn't know who I was and they didn't know whether they could trust me. And, it was challenging, but today it's not as difficult. Today, most people we contact do want to talk.
Now, Randy, have you ever been surprised by the direction that one of your books has gone? By that, I mean, does the finished product ever surprise you in terms of where you thought you were going when you started the book?
Gosh, you have the best questions. You do. Thank you for asking that, Harvey, because it is really true that I have no idea where the book is going. When I start a book, I have no idea because I do not outline my books. I don't outline my chapters. I don't think ahead of the present point that I'm writing at.
Really?
Yeah, I don't. I, for instance, when I wrote The Hiltons, I had no idea what that book was going to be about. No idea. Had no idea, never knew anything about Conrad Hilton. I just didn't have a clue. And the same holds true for all of my subjects. When I wrote Jackie, Janet, and Lee, I had no idea where that was going to go. No one had ever written about those three women before, so there was no research for me to look at to know where it was going to land. And I kind of don't want to know because I think that the excitement for me is in finding out along the way. And I think that if I can sort of relay that same excitement to the reader as he or she is reading the book, then it becomes a page turner, and it's as exciting for them as it is for me. So to answer your question, no, I have no idea. I do not outline my books. It would take me so long to outline one of my books. I might as well just write it. And I don't outline my chapters. I have no idea where anything is going. My researchers work way ahead of me, and they don't tell me what's happening. And then I don't know until I take a look at the research, and then I start putting it together in my head.
You know, that's very insightful to your fans, because when I read your books, I get the sense of spontaneity, and I get the sense that I'm on this journey with you and that it wasn't pre-planned. And now I know why. So thank you for that.
Thank you for noticing. I really appreciate that. I really do, because it's important for me. You know, anytime I write a book, I write it with the idea in my head of what kind of book would I like to read about this particular person. If I was a fan of this person, like when I wrote Beyonce, it was all, for me, the entire project was based on, if I was a huge fan, and of course I am a fan, but if I was a really big fan of Beyonce's and somebody who, you know, sort of idolized her, that what is it that I would want to know about her? And that really informed every aspect of that book. And that's really the way I think about my books.
Now, Randy, you've been quoted as saying that your writing style has changed from when you started out. As a young writer, your main focus was simply to tell the truth, state the facts, regardless of how brutal they might be. But now you have more empathy, more nuance. You're governed by a moral compass in terms of whether something you write might be hurtful. How did you evolve to that point?
Another good question. You know, when I first started out, I was a kid, and I probably had no right to do a book about anybody when I first started out. I had no right, really, because I had not lived my own life yet, and I didn't even understand my life, let alone presume to understand other people's. When I wrote Call Her Miss Ross, for instance, I didn't know anything about anything. I truly did not know anything other than struggle, because I had been struggling as a writer for many years, almost 15 years at that point, from the time I was a little kid. And so I knew about struggle, but I didn't really know about love and romance and the complexities of the way things are, you know.
And fame, the impact of fame.
And the impact of fame. I didn't know that either. And so, you know, you do the best you can as a kid. And I had New York Times bestsellers, so I guess I was able to convince people that I knew something. But then you grow up, and then you have your own life, and you experience your, you know, heartbreak, and you experience relationships, and you experience life. And then that's what you bring to your books. And you realize as you grow older that nothing is black and white, that everybody has complexities, that nothing is what it seems, and that people deserve a break. And I think that you also realize that everybody is doing the best they can with what they have to work with. And that knowledge makes you so much more empathetic as a person, but also as a writer. And so to answer your question, what happened was I grew up. You know, what happened was I finally started living a life of my own. And in doing that, I was able to understand people so much better.
Well, I want to ask you about some of the books now, starting with Diana Ross. You've written 3 books about her, culminating in your 2007 release entitled Diana Ross, a Biography. What is it about Diana Ross that has captivated you so much? I know you worked for the Supremes as a young guy.
I first met Diana Ross when she was 22, 23. I was 10, right? I was 10. And when I think about 10-year-olds today, it's hard for me to imagine, you know, that I was 10 and I was so sort of obsessed with Diana Ross and the Supremes, and then, you know, and I was the head of their fan club when I was a kid. I did that all through school until I graduated from school, and then I didn't go to college. Instead, Mary Wilson of the Supremes offered me a job in Los Angeles, and I went to Los Angeles to work for the Supremes. So I always had, you know, and I interviewed Diana Ross lots of times when I was a kid, and, you know, all through my, you know, adult life. I always just loved the sort of positivity and the against all odds of it all.
The focus.
The focus, and also sort of the making it against all odds that Diana Ross and all the Motown stars had in common back when I was a kid during the civil rights movement, when it was very different in some ways than it is today, and maybe not as different as we wish it was, And all of that really appealed to me. And I have to also say that my parents fostered this interest in me, because there is no way that I could have met Diana Ross at the age of 10 if my parents hadn't taken me to Steel Pier in Atlantic City, where the Supremes were performing. My parents took me all over the place to see the Supremes, the Temptations, and all the Motown artists. My mom and dad really encouraged this in me, and if they could have just easily discouraged it, and that would have made it impossible for me to be able to feed this fascination, and which then ultimately fed my career, but my parents wanted this for me. And when I was running the fan club as a kid, which I did from like the age of 10 to the age of, like almost 20, it really turned me into a sort of a careerist. I mean, I had a career basically from the time I was 10 years old.
Well, I got to tell you, the first time I ever saw you on television was on the Joan Rivers show, when she had you on to talk about the Diana Ross book. And Joan got frustrated with you because she was trying, in my opinion, she was trying to get you to say that Diana Ross was a bitch, and you would not say it. And you seemed so uncomfortable during that interview, and my heart went out to you.
Oh.
And do you remember the show I'm talking about?
Oh my gosh, yes. It was actually my first national television appearance, and it was very exciting for me. But I was a pretty cocky kid, and I think you have to be in order to do something like that when you're a kid, to go on television and be with Joan Rivers. And I remember sitting in the makeup chair, and Joan came and she sat next to me, and she was getting her makeup done. I was getting mine done, and she turned to me and she said, "So this is your first television appearance. I mean, are you nervous?" And I said to her, "No, of course not. I'm just going to be exactly who I am. I'm just going to be myself." And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, my dear, you need to be so much better than that." And at that point, then I was nervous, right? I'd been fine up until then, but I had no idea what she was talking about. Of course, now I understand, there's a big difference between being on television and just being the guy you are. The guy you are on TV is a bigger version of the guy that you are when you're with your friends at Starbucks. It's not the same guy. I didn't know that then, but I certainly learned it over the course of time. And while I was out there, you're right, she was really sort of hell-bent on having me say that Diana Ross is a bitch. Thankfully, I wasn't so intimidated by the experience that I actually would do that. There was still, I was very nervous, and it was a very upsetting moment for me, but there was still some small part of me that knew that this was not the way to go, and that this was unfair, and that I should not allow this to happen. And so I didn't, but you're right. We did have some back and forth about that, and she generally was not happy with that appearance. But
she had you on her show about 20 times.
I did, yes. I came back over and over and over again. So I think that
she clearly liked you.
She did, and I liked her too. And I think maybe she liked the fact that I held my ground. Joan was not a pushover, obviously, in her own life. And I think that she appreciated people who held their ground and were formidable in that way.
I'm surprised you never wrote a book about Joan Rivers.
Yeah, so am I, because I think that seems like a great subject for me. It seems like it's right up my alley, and something that my readers would like. So I wouldn't rule that out.
I think that you have the kind of sensibility that can really tap into the layered, textured personality of Joan Rivers, that she had so much insecurity. She had so many battles she fought to get where she got to. She had an enormous heart, but she had this incredible need to be validated. And of course, you see it with the plastic surgery as well. And I think she's a natural subject for you.
I do too. You know, I have not ever thought that, and it's never crossed my mind. But it is exactly the kind of person that I write about. So if I do that book, you know, I'll be sure to acknowledge you, because you're the first person to mention that to me. And people always have book ideas for me. You know, I mean, I get that all the time, and 99% of the time, it's not somebody that I think that I could really sort of immerse myself in, or it's not somebody that would make for a huge bestseller, and that's my publisher's mandate even more than mine. But when it comes to that idea, that sort of hits all the points. So thank you.
Yeah, I think she ticks off all the boxes. I can tell you that the number one person the fans of our show have asked me to ask you about writing about was Diana, Princess Diana. And my response was, I think she's been done.
Well, you know, she's not been done by me.
No.
So that's, I mean, I have written about lots of people who've been done. You know, I certainly, when I wrote Elizabeth Taylor, people were like, oh my God, how many more books about Elizabeth Taylor do we need?
No, but you wrote from the heart.
I feel like I would do the same with Princess Diana. You know, I've toyed with the idea of Princess Diana, and it's not so much that she's been done as much as she's still being done in this very moment.
Right.
You know, like there's just so much about her in this very moment still, that for me to try to sneak something in would just not maybe work. But I definitely think that that's something that I would like to write about. But if I were to write about Princess Diana, it would be more from the aspect of her family. It would be more about her relationship with the royal family and with her own family. It would be more family oriented than it would be just princess related. You know, that's how I would tackle it. That's how I tackled Princess Grace. That's
Right.
why both Princess Grace and Prince Rainier are on the cover of that book, because it's not a Princess Grace biography. It's really a biography of the two of them and their families. And I think that's how I would handle Diana, but it'd be a few years, I think, before I would want to go there.
I have to, before we leave Diana Ross, I have to ask you, did you ever find out what she thought of Call Her Miss Ross?
Yeah, I know she did not like it at all.
Yeah.
And I totally understand that. You know, I mean, there are aspects of Call Her Miss Ross that I don't like. I just, as I said before, it's maybe my most successful book. Anywhere I go in the world, people always ask me about Call Her Miss Ross. I mean, the title alone and the book jacket, you didn't even need it to be a good book because of that cover, you know, and because of the title. But I definitely feel like I would like to have done it differently. And I did have a chance to do it differently when I wrote about her in the third book, which is just called Diana Ross. And I think that she had to have loved, or at least she had to have liked that book a lot more. But, you know, Call Her Miss Ross is a tough book, but Call Her Miss Ross is of a time and place. You know, Call Her Miss Ross is of the sort of, you know, diva-ness of the 1980s. It's Call Her Miss Ross is of Dynasty, and it's of Joan Collins, and it's early Madonna, and it's you know, Diana Ross of a time and place. It's not Diana Ross of today. She's certainly not anything like she was when she was young, and neither are we. Hopefully we have changed and evolved with the passing of time. So Call Her Miss Ross is sort of frozen in time, and I love it from that aspect of it, but I just think that book is a little tougher than I wish it was, and I can understand why she isn't real happy with it.
Well, I think it was a tough time for her. Mary Wilson, who I just adored, and we're all still in mourning for Mary, she wrote a book about her experience in the Supremes roughly around the same time you released Call Her Miss Ross, and neither book painted a very warm portrait of Diana Ross. So I can understand that that was a tough time for her in terms of her public image.
Well, it's one of the reasons, and actually it's the only reason why Call Her Miss Ross is my only book that is not in print. Call Her Miss Ross, you cannot get it unless you go to eBay and buy an old copy. It's not available on Kindle. It's not available in paperback. It's not available anywhere. Unless you bought that original cover, Call Her Miss Ross, back in 1989, you do not have one. And I have had many offers from many people to put that book back in the marketplace, and I always turn it down. I've made a decision that really is like I said, of a time and place. I don't want it to color who Diana Ross is today, and perhaps when she's gone, maybe I'll allow it to be re-released. But and it's not that I'm ashamed of it. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's my first New York Times bestseller. I love it. People who are fans of hers always tell me that they loved her more after reading that book. I get that all the time. I just think it doesn't reflect my present sensibility as an author or her present sensibility as a woman. And that's why I haven't allowed it to be released.
Yeah, that's very fair. I want to move on now to Michael Jackson. Your first book about him was in 1991, and you updated it several times, most recently in 2009 with the book entitled Michael Jackson, The Magic, the Madness, the Whole Story. Now, it's well known that you knew Michael Jackson very well. Can you tell us anything about your friendship with him in light of what we've seen? And I'm specifically referring here to Leaving Neverland, which was the 4-part documentary series in 2009 featuring the 2 young men who accused Michael Jackson of child molestation.
Well, I met Michael when he was 12. We had a long, very, very long relationship. We had our ups and downs because I, became a writer and he became a star. But we always told each other the truth. And I have more amazing memories of Michael than anybody can possibly imagine. And I think that it's easy, to believe allegations about a person if you didn't know that person.
Right.
I knew Michael through the original allegations against him in '93. I covered the trial in 2005. I sat behind him every day in the courtroom. I mean, it's the allegations were as much a part of my life as anything else that's ever happened, and so I don't have a difficult time disbelieving them because I knew Michael, and I think that across the board, when you talk to people who actually knew Michael, that's what you will hear. And across the board, when you talk to people who did not know Michael, you're going to hear, just the opposite. And I just think that, I guess that there's not much more that I can say about it. I wrote about all of this extensively in my book. I'm actually producing a TV series about this right now for a network. I think that, gosh, I mean, I've written hundreds of thousands of words about it. I think most people know how I feel about Michael, and that I am always the first to defend Michael. And this is not to say that I haven't been critical of Michael. I've always been critical of Michael. Michael and I disagreed so many times on so many things, not the least of which was that I was never a big fan of his sort of commercializing his sort of dysfunctional childhood and identifying with that so strongly as an adult. I always wanted him to get past that. And I definitely didn't want him to use that as, for purposes of publicity or any of that, because I just felt that it was also damaging to him psychologically that, I wanted him to move past it. I wanted him to go into therapy. I wanted a lot of things from Michael that probably were not my place to want for him, but it's because I cared about him so much and I always wanted the best for him. And it was really incredibly sad for me over the period of decades, to watch him surround himself with people who had such terrible intentions. And he just often was not able to see that. And I think it's because Michael always saw the best in people, you know, and I was always able to see the worst in the people that surrounded him. And I wish that I could have convinced him to do the same, but you know, he was a grown man. I mean, and the thing about it, before, I don't want to go on too long about this, but the fact of the matter is that he and I were both young at the same time. And I didn't know anything about anything, and neither did he. You know, so for me to be able to try to give him advice, and for him to take it, you know, a lot of people said to me over the course of years, you know, where were you? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? I was around the same age as Michael. I didn't know. I had no sense either. I just did the best I could, as I think all of his friends did.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully expressed. And I'm glad that he had at least one really sincere, faithful friend in you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, can I tell you what my favorite book of yours is?
What's that?
Well, the one that moved me the most was the one about Grace Kelly, entitled Once Upon a Time, Behind the Fairy Tale of Princess Grace and Prince Rainier. Grace Kelly gave up an Oscar-winning career to marry a man she barely knew so she could become royalty. And you made it clear in the book that she soon realized that she made the biggest mistake of her life, but she found a way to make it work. And when I read your book, you have such enormous respect and admiration for her. You made me fall in love with her.
How great to hear you say that. You know, I just finished writing a pilot for television for a series that's based on that book. And you'll be seeing that probably next year. And it's my first script. That particular show is my first script. I mean, I've had my books turned into, adapted into miniseries, but I've never been the one to write them. I made a decision during the pandemic that I wasn't going to just waste that time. I mean, I thought it was going to be about 4 months, and I was like, I'm not going to waste these 4 months. So I decided to start writing my own scripts and to try to figure out a way to figure out how that's done, because I really had never done it before. And the first script that I wrote was based on Once Upon a Time, and it's a show that is called Monaco. And we sold it, and it's going to be on the air probably next year.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And so, yeah, I love that story, Harvey, because I think that we've all been in a situation where we thought we were making the right decision, and then we come to find out that we made the worst possible decision that we could have ever made. And that's where Grace found herself after she married Rainier. You know, as I explained in the book, she had her reasons for marrying him, but not on the list was her being in love with him. There were a lot of other reasons, but that was not on the list of reasons. She was not. They had only met one time before he proposed. So it wasn't like they didn't have they didn't have a love affair. And then once she married him and she ended up in Monaco, didn't speak French and didn't know anybody and was living in a palace with a man that she didn't even know, she realized that she had made a huge mistake. And then the challenge at that point was, what do you do when you realize that you have really screwed things up? How do you then rectify that? What do you do? Do you give up? Or do you do what Grace did, which was find a way to move forward and you know, as they say, you know, make lemonade out of lemons, you know. Right. And that's what she did. And I think it's such a great story.
Now, you've written 4 books about the Kennedys, the most recent one being The Kennedy Heirs, John, Caroline, and the New Generation, A Legacy of Triumph and Tragedy. And one of your books, Jackie, Ethel, Joan, Women of Camelot, was made into a TV miniseries, as you mentioned. And I understand you're currently working on your 5th book about the Kennedys. So I have to ask you, Randy, what is it about the Kennedys that inspired you to spend so many thousands of hours researching and writing about them?
Well, you know, the Kennedys are sort of the great American family in my mind. And I love family stories, and all of my books are sort of related to family stories. But when I think of the family that has had the most tragedy and the most sort of challenge, the most problematic situations, and also the most triumphant wins, I think of the Kennedys. And it's always so easy for me to just fall right back in because I love them. I know them. I've been to, to the Kennedy compound a number of times. I just can just sort of melt into that story, and it's fun for me. And so to answer your question as to why, I just love it and it's fun, and it must be because all of my Kennedy books are New York Times bestsellers when they come out. And so I think that my readers are sort of fascinated by my fascination.
That's right. That's exactly right. Now,
Yeah.
your biggest selling book is the one about Madonna. It's been translated into 12 languages. It's a worldwide bestseller. I want to read you something that one of my guests wrote in his book about Madonna after working with her. This is from Ray Clausen, who's a legendary set designer in Hollywood. This is what he wrote. She was a spoiled star, adept at abusing those around her with a mediocre talent and great marketing skills, but she does her homework. Ray designed this set for the Academy Awards on the night that she sang the song from the Dick Tracy movie. What do you think of what he said?
I think that it's true, but I think that people are, it's very, very, it's really not a good idea to paint people with a wide brush stroke. People ask me all the time, what is Madonna like? And I would not give an answer like that particular one, because that is how she was at that moment in her life. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what she's like today, or what she was like when 2 weeks before that moment, or 2 weeks after. People change. Sometimes they get worse, but then sometimes they get better. And I think that, as a biographer, you have to allow people the latitude of their journey. I started my Madonna book at a certain time in her life. I can't remember what year it was, but it was during the period of time when she was doing Justify My Love, and she was in the real S&M sort of mode in her music videos, and she had just put out the sex book. And I started my book at that point, and I was like, wow, this is not a great, I don't think this is a place where she's going to land. I think that this is a transition. And for me to write a book that ends at that point, it does not do her justice. I mean, that's not the way for me to honor Madonna. So I canceled that book. I started working on something else. I put that book aside for a number of years, and I waited. I waited until she got married to Guy Ritchie. I waited until she had children, Lourdes and Rocco. I waited until she found Kabbalah, and had spiritual convictions. I waited until she became a real person. And then I wrote the book. And by that time, the arc of the book was such that you were able to see the growth of a person that ended with a more well-rounded spiritual person who was a mother and a wife, and an interesting and more well-rounded individual than she would have been if I ended it with the sex book and Justify My Love. And
yeah, I love the evolution.
Yeah, I loved it too. And I love that book. I interviewed Madonna many times. She's another. I always love to say that we have a love-hate relationship. I love her; she hates me, and it's because we've had so many fallings out over the years, over all kinds of things. And at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think that any of my subjects, are my best and closest friends. I have friends in my life, but they're generally not celebrities. I think that I've never tried to sort of become the best friend of anybody that I've ever written about. I think that they have their own friends and I have mine. But what's important to me is that in that little period of time that I'm working on that book and the result of that book, it's so important to me that, that you see my affection and relationship with that person and that in that framework. That's important. But then, I move on to the next subject and I try not to hang on to the previous subject. And in fact, I usually don't even remember the previous book by the time it comes out because I've already started something else. And when Grace and Steel came out, for instance, it had been so long from the time that I finished Grace and Steel to the time that it was published. I had to sit down and read that book in order to be able to talk about it on my press tour. Because by the time Grace and Steel came out, I had already pretty much finished another book. And I didn't remember any of it. And so I move on psychologically pretty quickly.
I was fascinated by your book about Beyonce entitled Becoming Beyonce, The Untold Story. You write that on the one hand, she always wanted to be a major star from the time she was a little girl. But on the other hand, the career and life she's had is not what she envisioned for herself. And she's had to pay a price by letting go of her past and reinvent herself. From what you can tell, do you think she's happy with her life?
I do think that she's happy with her life today. It's been 5 or 6 years since that book came out. I think that it's very difficult when you're a really nice person to make it in show business. It's a lot easier, if you don't have the kind of sensitivity that Beyonce has. And she was raised a certain way by her parents. And she is a really nice person. And nice people tend to get taken advantage of in show business. And nice people tend to have to make some serious psychological changes within themselves in order to survive. And I think that it's often difficult for nice people in show business to adapt to who they have to become in order to make it and in order to survive. And I think that when Beyonce had to fire her father, for instance, as her manager, and, Michael Jackson had to do the same thing. I mean, this is, very common, but it's also very difficult. And those are the kinds of things that tend to harden people. So you got to have a real sort of moral code and moral core in order to survive in show business. And I think that Beyonce definitely has both.
Yeah, you really captured her resilience, I thought. Now, the most surprising book of yours was the one about the Bush women, Grace and Steel, Dorothy, Barbara, Laura, and the women of the Bush dynasty. Now, I don't know you, but something tells me you were probably not a big George W. Bush fan when he was in office. So I was surprised when you came out with a book about the Bushes. Am I right that this was inspired by Dorothy Bush, George W. Bush's grandmother?
You're absolutely right. What happened was I was writing about the Bushes years ago. I was not a fan of George W. Bush's, and I just had a very difficult time writing that book originally. And I told my publisher, I said, I can't do this. I just cannot write this book. I need to not write this book. This was years ago. And they said, well, what is it that you want to write instead? And Beyonce happened to be on the cover of Time magazine that week, and the magazine was on my desk. And I looked at it and I just said off the top of my head, what about Beyonce? And they were like, oh my God, that's a great idea. So we put aside the Bush book and I did Beyonce. Then 6 years went by and it still nagged at me, that wait a second, people began to look at George W. Bush in a different way and looked at his father in a different way. And I just felt like I wasn't giving them the opportunity to change. And I just felt like I needed to take another look at it. And when I took another look at it, I realized that what I needed to do was write about the women, that's where I land best. And Dorothy Bush, who is the mother of H.W. and W.'s grandmother, was an incredible woman who had never been written about ever. And she wrote a column syndicated in newspapers for many, many, many years, 3 times a week. And I was able to get access to all of these columns through the George Bush Library. And when I did, it was just sort of like this great sort of outline for a book. It was like I was doing personal interviews with this woman about her life and her family and her children and Barbara, and and it just made me love them so much. And I got to tell you, then I met W, and gosh, George W. Bush is such a great guy that I still don't think he was a good president. I'm sorry, but he's a great guy,
He's
and he's
looking
the
a
kind
lot
of,
better than he was after his successor. He was looking a lot better.
he started to look a lot better with the passing of time.
Yeah.
I really like W. I love Laura. I love Barbara. I interviewed Barbara. In fact, Barbara Bush was the reason why I started a Bush book, because I wanted to write Barbara's autobiography with her. And after I interviewed her, I was so impressed with her that I asked her, let me write a book with you. And at that point, she was already writing a book on her own. And H.W. Bush, President H.W., said to me, why don't you, just hold off and let's see what happens with her book. And if her book is not a success, then we'll circle back. Well, of course, her book was going to be a success. It came out, it was a huge success. And so I never had a chance to write a book with her, but I did have a chance to interview her, and I included all those interviews in my book.
Randy, in one of your recent Facebook posts, and I've got to tell you, I love following you on Facebook. I recommend it to all our viewers. But in one of those posts, you said that you actually don't enjoy writing, that it's hard work, and that you have to be very disciplined to make yourself do it every day. You made me realize that job satisfaction, which you do get when you see the finished product, is not the same thing as enjoying the job. Am I right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. When I wrote that post, a lot of people were like, "Wait, what are you talking about? What, how can you not enjoy it? Why are you even doing it if you don't enjoy it?" Don't get me wrong. I love having written, and I love many aspects of writing. But I've been writing since I was 10 years old, and it's a lot of work, and it's hard work. And I've never been the kind of writer who can take a notepad out to the beach and sit in front of the setting sun and jot down my thoughts. I always have to have lots of computers around me and tons of research and all kinds of books and files and all kinds of it's like it's homework. It's like I have been doing homework for like the last 40 years. It's homework. So, I hope people understand that I'm not saying I don't enjoy my job, because obviously I do. I could just stop, and I'm not doing that. I'm writing a book right now. And, it's just that I want people to understand, that whatever it is that you do, if it's hard and you don't enjoy it, then you can stop. But if it's hard and you don't enjoy it, but you still love it, then just, you got to, especially writing, it takes discipline. I am the most disciplined person probably that I've ever met. I have to write a certain number of words a day. And if I don't, I have to catch up on weekends. And if I do, I can take weekends off. I am my own best parent when it comes to writing. And you really have to be. You can't be, if you're going to have a career as a writer, you can't be the kind of person who just writes sometimes and sometimes you don't. You have to be a person who writes all the time. And that's what I tell people when they say to me, how do I become a writer? How you become a writer is you have to write all the time. Even if there are those days that, has often happened to me, you don't want to. You still have to, if you want to become a professional writer.
Well, you've had quite a life yourself. You've met and gotten to know some amazing and iconic people, and you've become a media personality in your own right, in addition to being a writer. I'm wondering if you'll ever write a memoir.
I've been putting a lot of my personal stories up on Facebook, just because I just thought that would be interesting. And the response to them has been unbelievably great. People love my stories. I don't know that I have a book, Harvey. What I have is a lot of anecdotal information. I have all kinds of anecdotes of things that happened to me, and I'm not sure that that's a book. I think a book needs to be, something bigger than just, here's what happened to me when Tom Cruise wanted me to go up in a plane with him, or here's what happened to me when Madonna, had a temper tantrum with me backstage at the Grammys, and here's what happened to me when, I don't know that that's a book as much as those are really, really good anecdotes and they're fun to read.
Well,
Maybe one day.
can I beg to differ?
Yeah.
I think that those anecdotes, if they were punctuating a book that dealt with your own personal evolution from a guy that started out just the facts, man, just the facts, without regard to the emotional impact of those facts, to the person you've become now, which is very nuanced. You are compassionate, you're empathetic, you really have a sense of trying to understand the challenges of the people that you write about and how you came to that point where you still got the facts right. I mean, you're not being sued left and right for defamation, so you're getting the facts right, but you write in a way that gives your reader a sense of how complex some of the decisions are, the choices are, the environments these people live in. I think the way you evolved from your own family upbringing, working for the Supremes, all the way to now, with some of those anecdotes, would be a fascinating book.
Well, thank you, Harvey. I really appreciate that. I think that if I ever decide to do that, this interview is where I will turn to put it into context, because you have done such a great job of taking my career and turning it into a story. And that would be the biggest challenge for me with a book. And you've managed to do it in the course of 1 hour interview. So I really appreciate that so much. And thank you very much for that.
Oh, thank you, Randy. I'm a huge fan of your work. I told you why. It's because you make me feel like I got to know the people you've written about. Now I feel like I got to know you. I'm so grateful you took the time to appear on our show. And if I can be of any assistance in interviewing you more so that you can get your story down, please call on me. I'd love to do it.
Absolutely. I will do that, Harvey. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you very much.
I hope you'll come back to our show with every new book, every new project, every new mini series, because you are always welcome. I'm a huge fan. Thank you so much, Randy.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Our guest has been author and media personality, Randy Taraborrelli. My name's Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Remember to subscribe to the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. And be sure to check out more great interviews with Harvey Brownstone on harveybrownstoneinterviews.com.